Yo, so my comment section went crazy yesterday. Did a video, Bud Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., how that fight might play out, and Danny Garcia's slander. But born from that video and the comments on that video, shout out to my man Banks Law. He asked the question, lefty versus lefty, how does Bud Crawford look? How does Errol Spence Jr. look? And how many opportunities have they had to be in that situation or scenario? A little bit of film study here. This is your boy JG. This is the Punch Report. In this video, we examine Bud Crawford versus lefties, Errol Spence Jr. versus lefties. Let's go. Like I said before, y'all, welcome back to the channel. This is your boy JG. This is the Punch Report. Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon to be notified of the latest and greatest. Let's get into it right now. Starting off with Bud Crawford, he had two opportunities to face off against guys that are strictly left-handed fighters, Julius Indongo and Felix Diaz. We're going to move to the clips right now. First, taking a look at Felix Diaz. Now, I think this is a good exercise to examine how they may look against each other. The problem is this. Felix Diaz, Julius Indongo, and Keith Van Heerden, who Errol Spence fought, who was also a lefty, are all very, very different fighters. The approaches are different. And especially with Bud Crawford, when we get into the clips, you're going to see a very different Bud Crawford in these stages, 35 and 40 are both at 40, than you see at 147 pounds, but for good reasons. Going to Felix Diaz. If you take a look at the clip right here, one of the things that I noticed about Terence Bud Crawford is his jab is more offensive. He's fighting a shorter opponent that's trying to be aggressive, and he's operating behind the jab very intelligently and able to put himself in a position to do damage with the jab. One of the things that's notable about this fight and why it's not a good comparison for Errol Spence Jr. and how it may look lefty versus lefty is in the first round, like a minute into the first round, Felix Diaz gives up on the jab. He goes high guard exclusively, as we look at the clips here, and tries to walk Bud Crawford down. And he just gets touched up. Now, his overhand left landed several times against Bud Crawford, surprised him but didn't hurt him or stun him in any way. Crawford has to clean up some of those defensive, or did clean up some of those defensive mistakes. I don't really see him getting hit with that shot per se at this juncture in his career. The other thing I want to take note of with this clip, with this fight with Felix Diaz, as well as the Julius Indongo fight, is Bud Crawford has gotten substantially better with his feet. Very hyper feet, and when we get to the Indongo fight, I'll highlight this as well. Very busy, very hyper feet, and having to overcorrect for being out of position because of that footwork. Bud Crawford at 147 pounds, very short-footed fighter, doesn't make a lot of critical errors from the footwork perspective, puts himself in a position constantly to land effective counter shots. And that's what he excels at. Moving over to Julius Indongo clips. Now, these clips are only slightly better as a comparison to Errol Spence Jr. because Indongo at least starts with the jab and trying to control distance and maintain range and figure out what's going to be appropriate for him. As we get into the clips here, you'll see kind of an example of that. Now, what you're also going to see coming up right now is this is in the first round. Bud Crawford has the opportunity to land a beautiful counter shot, clips Indongo. From this point moving forward, Indongo does not do anything effective whatsoever. Part of the issue is he was already starting from too far outside, and I'll illustrate that as well with the clips, and lunging in. We know if you lunge in against Bud Crawford, what that means. You probably going to get cooked. Indongo did this early. He was made to pay early. If you look at the first round, going back to the feet, take a look at these shots of Bud Crawford's feet. Very busy, very choppy, moving around unnecessarily, wasting real estate, doing some of those things. But you can already start to tell the maturity in Bud Crawford because as we move to the second round where the stoppage occurred, his feet are much more settled, much more calm. He puts himself in a much better position to land those counter shots. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the fight ending sequence for Indongo and Bud Crawford. It's a lot of the same that you saw in the first round of the fight. Overcommits on something, really dives all the way in there, half step back, gets on the angle as Bud Crawford, lands a devastating shot to the body. The rest is history. Fun fact, this is a very similar setup that caught Shawn Porter slipping. So this is an area that Bud Crawford is very familiar with and trained in. if you are going to overcommit, you are either going to be made to pay dearly or just get stopped brutally. And before I go over to Van Heerden and Spence and how he fared and looked against Southpaws himself, one of the things that's notable in the Felix Diaz fight is, I'm not sure when they stopped it. Shout out to Buddy McGirt. Buddy McGirt was his trainer for that fight. It waved off in the corner. But this is what I say about Bud Crawford. I do not think that he's the biggest puncher. Now, he closed up Felix Diaz's eye, and I think it's been a while since I've seen him do that to someone. But typically, he's going to accumulate damage on you, and if you make the mistake, it's the precision and the accuracy of the punches that really gets you up out of there. But typically, it's later in the dance, 10, 11, 12th round. It's not a knock. It's just kind of a reality. I think Errol is durable enough, minus a bunch of mistakes, to withstand some of that. As you see here with your Dennis Ugas bout here, Errol Spence Jr. has a different type of power where maybe he's not one-punching people either, but if he can't one-punch you, he's going to disfigure you, maim you, hurt you in a multitude of different ways. Felix Diaz did his best to hang in there, throw a winging shot, some of which landed, but he never really threatened Crawford, and he got pieced up. Moving over to Errol Spence Jr., Keith Van Heerden. This fight is not a good example of what it may look like against a Terence Bud Crawford. Bud Crawford at 147 pounds is not as mobile. I don't know if it's by choice or because, his legs are slowing down, but he's not as mobile. But he's not going to do what you're going to see here in these clips with Van Heerden, which is stand in front of a big, strong guy like Errol Spence Jr. Now, Van Heerden had good size, but he just didn't have the skill, the ability, the will, the know-how to combat a fighter like Errol Spence Jr. Let's move into the clips. The first thing I want you to take note of is the space between Van Heerden and Spence as he deploys offense. He's closing behind the jab intelligently and then going for bigger shots. Now, as the fight wears on, you'll see Errol Spence Jr. is going to start putting damage on the opposition. As I mentioned before, not the greatest example, but it allows you to see kind of what Errol's operating stance is when faced with another southpaw. And he's confident, and he's able and he's willing. Now, what I would say with the Van Heerden clips is sometimes Errol Spence gets very, very comfortable with the work that he's putting in. You got to be cognizant of some shit coming back at you. Van Heerden was a big puncher, big guy, good power, sparred a bunch of good dudes, Canelo and a bunch of other cats that he sparred with, felt good and confident going into this bout. And it wasn't enough to keep Errol off of him, but sometimes Errol looks a little bit surprised about shit coming back at him, especially if he's been pouring it on a guy. You got to look for the dummy roll. You got to look for if a guy's not wincing and bent over or you haven't dropped him, there's always a possibility that something's coming back. Be disciplined in your hand exchange. Blade yourself. Make sure you have a narrow stance. Be intelligent. If you are going against an opponent who's doing an effective job with a high guard or they're catching and parrying really well, then take that half step back, jab the body, then go back to work, which he's super effective of, that being Errol Spence Jr. So that is my time. Let me know what you guys think. Lefty versus lefty. The one thing I take away from this video is Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. are ready to combat each other from that perspective. And one thing, shout out to Banks Law, my bad. One thing I'm going to say to Banks Law that I totally agree with is because Bud Crawford is so effective in that southpaw mode, I can't see him wasting any time saying, hey, I'm going to be orthodox for a bit. I just can't see that unless he's getting desperate and he just wants to try something different to mount offense. I cannot see that. I expect him, like you mentioned, to pretty much just be in southpaw, and we have a southpaw versus southpaw fight. Before I go, I lied a little bit. Before I go, two other things I want to highlight. There's a punch I'm going to pull up from the Felix Diaz fight, and I really do feel like this would be Bud's secret weapon if he's going to get it done in a sensational way, spectacular manner. Knockout, bunch of knockdowns or whatever. And it's this, some may call it a swivel jab, but it's the backhand. It's his left hand as his backhand, so in the southpaw position, and it just comes kind of at a crazy ass angle, but it's sharp and it's effective. And he unloaded this on Diaz multiple times. He's unloaded on a lot of guys. Pause. That was crazy. But that's a hyper effective punch. And if Errol's in one of those kind of low spaces and Bud Crawford fights off rhythm, can get that off, it can be a significant shot for him. That would be what I would consider his secret weapon. For Errol Spence Jr., Bud Crawford can be put in questionable defensive situations. He can take advantage of those. But like I said before, you got to be careful as you close in and try to do your thing offensively, because unless Bud's on skates, and even then, you might get caught with some shit. I look forward to this fight. Very good fight, compelling fight. Let me know what you guys think overall. Lefty versus lefty. The breakdown. Felix Diaz, high guard, gave up on the jab, got cooked. Julius Indongo got countered in the first round and never really recovered from that. Lived on the outside, overcommitted, got stopped. Moving over to Keith Van Heerden. Big guy, strong, good power, stood in front of Errol, which is a mistake. Errol's ability to maintain distance, close intelligently, and then work the body till you get to stoppage is what makes him a great fighter. This is your boy JG, we out.